Now let's go ahead and look at the major stories that made the rounds this morning. And of course, one of it is the caution from the DMOs against more borrowings, of course, to the federal government. And to have that conversation with us this morning is Barrister Jide Ologun. Good morning, sir. You're welcome.
Good morning.
Okay, so the DMO has come out to say we've been borrowing a lot, still almost borrowing, and they have their reservations about that, which of course has become very obvious to everybody in the country. But how do you react to that caution?
That caution is very welcome if you consider the fact that the last count, most recent report, placed the total indebtedness of Nigeria at 77 trillion naira. It was around 12.12 trillion in March 2015. And if you have such a burden that takes over 90% of your revenue in servicing, you are not even talking about paying the substance, then you must be careful how you go about managing your economy going forward, because some of us have argued that the problem of Nigeria is not that of resources, but resourceful management of the resources. I mean, many have been amazed to realize that about 7 trillion naira goes into fuel subsidy without any benefit to the citizens, when some few Nigerians and their international Kabbalic colleagues just sit on what should create commonwealth for common good. And I think the reforms that are going on now, if we succeed in blocking these loopholes and we can safeguard our revenue drive, then we may not need to go borrowing extensively, because basically borrowing is part of government. Even the United States government, they borrow. And again, what do you use what you borrow for? But basically, which is a private principle for myself, I've learned in the word of God that the borrower is a slave to the lender, and I really don't want to be a slave. So Nigeria should not be a slave. We have huge resources that can make us rich. So I implore the government to listen to that and see how we can restructure our economy to have enhanced revenue drive that will be channeled to relevant capital project that will now create the enabling environment and platforms for foreign direct investment. And it's so cheering to hear that while in France, the president is already engaging in talks with the UK, the US, Switzerland, and some foreign investors who are beginning to show interest again in Nigeria. And again, we must clean up the insecurity in the country. So I support that counsel.
All right. We would have continued that insecurity conversation also, because one of the major stories that came up this morning, maybe not very major because it wasn't the lower strip, but how that I think a former minister was saying something about state policing. But that is probably a conversation we'll get the opportunity to have some other day. However, I'd like for us to look into the negotiations going on between the NLC, the TUC, and the federal government on measures to alleviate the impact of the removal of the petrol subsidy on Nigerians. The federal government and the labor union have agreed on an 8-week timeline to restore and implement their demands. It was recalled that the National Industrial Court of Nigeria restrained the labor unions from embarking on the proposed strike. The federal government had asked the court for an interim injunction preventing the labor unions from proceeding. And of course, this is one of the major conversations we're supposed to be having this morning. And if you want to look at the demands, part of the demands put forward by the TUC is, of course, to maintain status quo of PMS pump price while the discussion continues. Minimum wage should be increased from the current 30,000 naira to 200,000 naira before the end of June 2023, with consequential adjustment on the cost of living allowance like feeding, transport, and housing. And also tax holiday for employees, both in government and private sector, that earn less than 200,000 naira or $500 monthly, which is high, whichever is higher. And of course, immediate review of the National Health Insurance Scheme to cover more Nigerians and prevent out of stock of drugs. And now these are the demands that are being made by the labor unions. Let us look at these demands. How feasible do you think they are?
You know, they're legitimate demands, but you just asked a brilliant question: how feasible? For instance, if you want to increase the minimum wage to 200,000 naira per month, and you look at the consequential adjustment, do we have the muscle to carry that, or is it just another promise that, okay, we will do it? The minimum wage was increased to 30,000 naira. How many states have been able to effectively deploy the minimum wage? And some of us have argued that when you are embarking on your monetary and fiscal management, you also need to consider those who are not in the formal sector. So if, for instance, the NLC succeeds in getting the government to increase the minimum wage to 200,000, what message does this send to the market woman? Oh, the workers now have more money. So what happens? The inflation jumps up. It's around 24% now. So maybe flies to 35%, messing up that increase. So I think we should look more into investing in sustainable interventions. For instance, transportation. How can we reduce the cost of living? I'm glad to be reading about compressed gas. You know, how you can then, again, though the government is also planning to remove the energy tariff subsidy, you know, so what are the alternatives that we have? If we hang it just on money, increasing minimum wage, it may not help. And when you talk about the health facilities, these are variables in human resources management that will make life easier for the people, you know. And I think if we focus more on that, we can now link it with our developmental plans, you know, the basic infrastructure, the basic amenities. Then we invest in education, those things that put pressure on families. And that is the essence of palliative. Palliative means you are dealing with symptoms without actually dealing with the root cause. So it's just a momentary thing. So I want to advise that we focus on the root cause, even if we have to pay some price on that. I'm sure that when Lee Kuan Yew started moving Singapore from a third world country in 1965 to the first world country it is today, they went through some painful experiences, but he focused on substantives, not palliatives. And then with the state the government is right now, because the government is broke, obviously, such demand, except one will go on massive borrowing, it may not be met. Then you look at how we can become more productive. Can we reinvent our refineries, make them functional, create jobs, and be accountable? Accountable, you see. I mean, most recently, NNPC dazzled us with zero remittance in Federation accounts, which is against the intention when it was established on the 1st of April 1977 to create Commonwealth for common good. So the negotiations are ongoing, and I must commend how it's been handled. So we expect that at the table, NLC will not be on the table, but at the table to negotiate what will make life easier for the people. But having said all this, I sense that it may just be theoretical, looking at the reality we have right now. Even if promises are made that we increase this and that, where is the money?